QSO Today, episode 419, Lauen Libby W0LD, remastered. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by Icom America, makers of the finest amateur radios and accessories for your ham radio station, and by Nuts and Bolts magazine. Just a reminder that we have a leaderboard that updates in real time on our show notes page, recognizing the generous support that we get from listeners. Our sponsors and listeners make it possible to bring you QSO Today every week, and I appreciate it. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is in on-demand mode now until October 16th. This means that if you missed the Expo weekend, you can still go back and view the presentations that were made at the Expo and the question and answers that followed. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4 Zulu 1 Uniform Golf, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Lauen Libby W0LD was my guest on the QSO Today podcast 5 years ago this month, and because of a confluence of events including the Ham Expo and the holidays of the Jewish New Year, I decided this week to go back into the QSO Today catalog and remaster an amazing interview that I had with Lauen. What's more, I got to meet Lauen in person at the Dayton Hamvention last May, helping me to better choose the now remastered episode of episode 161. Lauen's love of radio broadcasting brought him to amateur radio, his interest in DXing by meteor scatter and EME moon bounce. Lauen made his career in radio broadcasting and is the CEO of the world's largest international shortwave broadcasting network. W0LD is my QSO Today. W0LD, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Lauen?
I am. Hello there. How are you doing? 4Z1UG from W0LD.
I'm great, Lauen. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it actually started on a farm out in Kansas. I was interested in radio and actually built a broadcast transmitter on an AM frequency that was on a national farm frequency that in South Dakota, and all the farmers were listening to markets and everything. And my little 15-watt transmitter with a 1,000-foot long wire antenna between the house and the barn carried a little too far. One day got a call from the Federal Communications Commission, and my father answered the phone, handed me the phone, and said, "Kid, I think this is for you." And so on the other end was the chief engineer in Kansas City. He said, "We understand you're running an illegal radio station." And I said, "Well, I'm just interested in that sort of thing." He said, "Well, we put people in jail for doing that." And I was about 10 years old. And he said, maybe you ought to get yourself a ham radio license and you'd have a whole lot more fun and you'd hear from me a whole lot less. And in fact, that gentleman and I became very good friends, and he became a silent key several years ago. But that's how I kind of got interested in ham radio.
Was he a ham?
Yes, he was.
And what was his name and call sign? Do you remember?
H.W. Burrell was his name, and I'm trying to remember his call sign. It was a 0, obviously, but it doesn't come to my mind right now.
He tells you to get a ham license. What does a kid in rural Kansas do?
Well, a kid in rural Kansas begins to read some ARRL materials, and I thought, oh, no, I got to learn the International Morse Code. So I found a ham in my hometown, WA0HOZ, who happened to have some records, some CW learning records. I think they were by Amico back in those days. And so every Wednesday night, another friend and I would go down, sit in his basement, and learn the International Morse Code. And that's how we learned the code. And then ended up taking the test. In those days, you could, if you were over 75 miles from an FCC test point, you could take it, they would send it to you, and an amateur would sit down and give you the 5-word per minute code test, and then they would send the written test. And over the kitchen table of W0NRJ in Kensington, Kansas. I took those tests and ended up with the technician license and it turned out that I was 2 miles further. I was like 72 or 73 miles from Omaha, Nebraska, which was a test point. And my father was not interested in driving me to Omaha to take the amateur test, so I couldn't get the conditional license, so I ended up with a technician for a number of years.
What year was that?
Oh, that would have been back, oh goodness, in the 60s? Yeah, probably the mid-60s. I was about 12 years old by that time. And
your first call sign?
My first call sign was WN0LSH, which turned in then to WA0LSH because you could only hold the novice license for 1 year at that point. Then, since I was a technician, I got interested in VHF and UHF operating, and in those days it was kind of like an interesting science. And got on 6 meters, got on 2 meters, and that started me out in terms of what I'm still interested in today, and it's experimentation with propagation and how in the world do you make signals go far on bands that they're not supposed to go far on.
We'll pick that up in just a second. I remember interviewing Bob Heil. It sounds like he kind of had the same experience where he ends up operating VHF and UHF, lots of power as well. What was your first station then as a new technician?
Well, when I was a novice, I had a little 15-watt CW transmitter. It was the Amico transmitter. It was a little kit that you would get, and it came through the mail. Put it together and bought a Helicrafter's S53A receiver. And, of course, being a kid, I didn't have a whole lot of money, and my father was not really interested in financing an amateur radio station. So I remember he took me out and showed me an acre of land and said, you figure out how to get the money if you want to buy those radios. And so I ended up planting 1 acre of popcorn and harvested it by hand, hand-shelled it, took it to town and sold it for $5 for a 10-pound bag, and would sell it on street corners and into the grocery stores in a town. And that's how I got enough money to be able to leverage myself into amateur radio.
Oh, that's amazing. How much popcorn does 1 acre produce?
A lot. Let me tell you, it's incredible.
Is popcorn different than other regular corn?
Oh, it is. It's the kind of thing, that you put in the microwave and it pops. And so this was homegrown popcorn, and people really liked it. So just a matter of being able to, that's how I learned how to market it at an early age.
Well, it also sounds to me like it increases your ability to have patience for things. I mean, you're literally watching the radios grow out of the ground.
Yes. I mean, you would sit there, and the crop would come up in April and May, and hopefully by September, October, or November, I could buy another receiver or another transmitter.
Oh, so you operated this acre of popcorn more than one season?
I did. Eventually, it ended up being a 6-meter station with a couple of stacked Yagis at about 40 feet and a pair of 100 THs that ran 500 watts on CW, a BC348 receiver with a new Vista front end, and operating 6-meter scatter. There were a number of stations on the air those days, all the way from Colorado to Ohio. And with that kind of power and with that kind of antennas, we could, you could operate fairly reliably just using forward ionospheric scatter. And so that's what got me interested in propagation.
So if you're sitting out in the middle of a cornfield, then the noise level must have been really low, and you didn't have a lot of people complaining about television interference.
No, that's true, and particularly on 6 meters when you're running 500 watts with an old converted Motorola amplifier. The biggest problem was that when I would key it down, the local REA, the Rural Electrification Association, they would draw the voltage down on the power lines, and our neighbors within a couple of miles, their lights would dim with the CW. And occasionally I would get a phone call from one of the neighbors saying, are you operating on the air again? And because our lights are flashing.
Let me ask you a question. The Motorola amplifier, I haven't spoken to anybody about a Motorola 500-watt amplifier, but Motorola used to have an amplifier called a green box. Was that a green box?
No, this was a low-band FM 500-watt FM amplifier that was used for police applications and that sort of thing. And so a number of us got a hold of these because they were being surplused out. And, you could cut a turn off. Since they were at 49 megahertz, you just cut a turn off the input and cut a turn off the output and kind of tuned it up. And all of a sudden, voila, you had 500 watts with a pair of 100 THs, these big round tubes that glowed in the night.
Now, you were obviously smitten by radio through your teenage years. Did ham radio play a part then in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Oh, it did. When I was about 14, I remember going over to a local AM radio station, and I was really interested in broadcasting. And I went over, and the manager, I sat down and looked at him, and who, by the way, was a very good friend and mentor to me. And I said, do you believe in giving youth an opportunity? And he said, well, of course. And I said, well, I'm a youth, and here's an opportunity. So I started sweeping the radio station on Saturdays. I would go in and basically be a janitor. And one day the news director showed up drunk, and they fired him on the spot. And they didn't have anybody to go on the air. And so they handed me the copy and said, well, how would you like to go on the air? And I said, well, sure, I'd love to do that. And so, here's a kid, 15-year-old kid, and you go on the air, and one thing led to another, and the owner of that radio station owned 6 other radio stations across Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado. And he was the one who was responsible. He sort of liked me, and I became his fair-haired boy and worked in all of those radio stations as I went to undergraduate school and learned the business. A tremendous man. I'm very, very indebted to this man by the name of Norton Warner, who did a great job, and that's how I got into broadcasting. And when I went to Kansas State, he actually made a phone call to the people who ran the radio station at Kansas State University and said, you need to hire this kid. He's pretty good. And so I ended up talking my way through undergraduate school. Every day was on the air, and I had a great time.
Did you take a technical major at Kansas State College?
No, I did not. And the reason I didn't is because I thought, there are a lot of people who have that. I was interested in business, and I was more interested in the business side of the equation. And so my undergraduate degree was in economics. In business, had a great time, and I since I'd been in broadcast and worked in radio stations, I remember I would take these broadcasting courses kind of as a fun thing, and would end up usually teaching them because the professors, many of them, had not even worked in a broadcast situation on a daily basis.
And you say you have an advanced degree beyond the BA?
Yeah, I have an MBA. So picked that up a little later in life. Before online classes were there, we went nights and on Saturday, and ended up getting an MBA degree and done other studies and sort of things, not in a formal way, but life is a big educational process, as you well know.
Yeah, that sure is. Well, before we hop back to ham radio, how have you spent your life professionally?
I've been in nonprofit work most of my life in terms of nonprofit. Right after I got out of undergraduate school, went to Chicago and forecast commodity future prices, pork bellies and cattle and wheat and corn and that sort of thing, and actually gave market reports over the air to a chain of about 140 radio stations, and worked as an economist for a economic consulting firm in Chicago, and then went into the nonprofit arena and moved to Colorado Springs, Colorado, and we lived there until 2008, and then ended up moving to North Carolina, and currently in our current role that we currently serve in nonprofit broadcast area.
What's your current rig?
My current rig is a K3. I have a K3, and I also have a little Yaesu FT991 Alpha that I carry with me internationally. I travel internationally a lot, and so I carry it with me in a briefcase and operate many times in many different environments and have a great time with it. Then I have a number of VHF, UHF rigs that Icom has built over the years, single band radios and amplifiers. And, even here at work, a number of us are amateur radio operators. And so since we live in a townhome and I can't have a station there, we have a station at work. And so we have, a kilowatt all the way from 160 through 1296.
And now this message from Icom America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. This summer, keep your competitive contesting edge with Icom. Our high-powered base stations cut through pile-ups, letting you work the bands and log those contacts. Contest from the comfort of your home or remotely with the RSBA1 app. The Icom IC7851 gives you a new window into the RF world, and its on-air excellence is unparalleled. With faster processors, high input gain, high display resolution, and a cleaner signal, it's truly the pinnacle of HF perfection. Features include dual receivers, digital IF filters, memory keyer, digital voice recorder, high-resolution spectrum waterfall display, enhanced PC connectivity, and an SD memory card slot. The Icom IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants. This high-performance SDR can pick out faint signals in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The Icom IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that has changed the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. Its features include RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receiver, and dual digicell. Create your own band openings with the Icom IC9700. This transceiver brings direct sampling to the UHF-VHF weak signal world. This all-mode transceiver is loaded with innovative features that are sure to keep you busy that include faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. This has become the new de facto standard as a baseband rig for microwave operation as well. Features include 4.3-inch touchscreen color TFT LCD, real-time high-speed spectrum scope and waterfall display, smooth satellite operation with 99 satellite channels, dual watch operation, and full duplex operation in satellite mode. The Icom IC7300 is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed expectations. This innovative HF transceiver digitizes RF before various receiver stages, reducing inherent noise in different IF stages. The IC7300 changed the way entry-level HF is designed. It is the go-to rig in my station now, and I love it. Features include RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, and an SD memory card slot. Just know that you'll be very pleased with one of these fine rigs to enhance your contest, DX, and general ham radio operation in your station. Be sure to check out these Icom rigs and their full line of base stations and portable radios at an amateur radio dealer near you. And when you make that purchase of a fine Icom rig, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO Today. I wanted to go back to the VHF, 6 meters and 2 meters. You really cut your teeth on operating above 50 megahertz. You spoke earlier about propagation and talking distances. It's my understanding that not only have you worked all states, but you've worked all countries in the VHF, UHF range. What's the secret to getting started to be able to operate internationally on these frequencies?
First of all, I worked all states and all continents on 2 meters. I was always interested in 2 meters and got into moon bounce. When I was in college, I really wasn't very active as a ham because I didn't have a whole lot of time. And then, you get out of college and you go to work and, you're learning how to become an adult in the whole field of commerce. And finally, one day I moved to Colorado Springs and I'd gotten married and, my wife said, honey, you really need a hobby. I said, well, what do you think? And she said, well, why don't you figure out what you'd like to do? And I said, well, I've got an amateur radio license and I used to play around with it. He said, why don't you do that? So I ended up buying a transceiver 2-meter transceiver and began to mess around and do some meteor scatter work, and bought an amplifier and put up a large array. And I always wanted to do a moon bounce, EME. And so in the backyard, put up 4 Yagis and at an 8877 for 2 meters, which would do 1,500 watts, and began to do moon bounce. And I thought, it'd be really nice to be able to work all states. And so as you draw a circumference of about 1,100 miles around Colorado, there are some states that you just can't get unless you go to the moon on EME, like Alaska, Hawaii, in New England. And so over about a 2.5 year time period, worked all states on 2 meters and worked all continents, because, if 2 stations can see the moon, then you can obviously communicate with EME. So that led to several things, and then I got interested in the microwave bands. There was a gentleman by the name of Don Hilliard, and Don's call was W0PW, and earlier he had been W0EYE, and he'd invented some antennas that the National Bureau of Standards had perfected up in Boulder, Colorado. And so I began to put up large Yagi arrays and high power, and you can work. People don't realize what you can do. Even at 1.2 gigahertz, if you have enough power and enough antenna, you can work 500 miles anytime, day or night. And so began to do that, began to play around on 2.3 gigahertz, 5.7 gigahertz, 10 gigahertz, and began to set some distance records. W5LUA down in Dallas, and I used to operate, and I'd go to the top of Pikes Peak, which is 14,110 feet, and operate up there on the microwave frequencies. And at 2.3 gigs, worked like 500 miles on aircraft scatter, bouncing signals off of aircraft. So that was kind of interesting, in the 90s, and experimented with that, and read a number of studies that the National Bureau of Standards had done on tropospheric scatter studies back in, would have been the 60s and early 70s. And this fellow, Don Hilliard, W0PW, had been a part of that research from the National Bureau of Standards. And so, it was intriguing to be able to do things that most people thought were impossible, and to do it in such a way that, it really advances the state of art and the state of communication. And so, that's how I really got interested in the higher bands. And it's always been an intriguing interest to me. And in fact, now with WSJT, Joe Taylor, a very famous amateur, came up with that digital protocol that's people are using on HF and VHF, and that has really furthered it, because all of a sudden you can detect signals 20 dB below the noise floor. And so we're messing around with that right now, and it's an intriguing thing. If you have curiosity and you're interested in things that can't normally be done, you can get on 20 meters anytime world, but to do it on 432 or to do it on 1296, that's a whole different ball game.
Okay, so what kind of equipment then? If you're going to do it on 432, I guess you could use a K3 with a transverter or something like that. What would you use these days, or what did you use then?
Well, actually, I'm still using it. It's an Icom 475H. It's a 100-watt transceiver. It's probably one of the best single-band transceivers that ever been built. Icom built a whole series of them from 6 meters through 1.2 gig, and I own most of them. And they're single-band radios. They're very stable. And then operate. I've gone to solid-state amplifiers, solid-state on 2 meters, solid-state on 432. Have a solid-state kilowatt amplifier for 1.2 gig. And the current thing right now is on 1.2 gig is I've got 4 50-element Yagis on ASL, and getting ready to do 1.2 gigahertz moon bounce with WSJT on 1.2 gigahertz, and do some playing around on that band again.
Now, for a guy that's not near Pikes Peak, he's sitting in the middle of Downey, California, or the metropolitan area. Can he successfully do moon bounce from his backyard on 1.2 gigahertz?
Sure. Oh, yeah. I mean, you think about a 50-element Yagi on 1.2 gigahertz is only about 18 feet long. And 4 of them, stacked 3 feet by 3 feet on ASL. I mean, that's not a large array, really. On 2 meters, now you need some real estate to do it on 2 meters or even 432. But since this WSJT technology has come in, it's not CW. In the old days, I mean, you had to sit there and have enough gain, enough power, and big enough antenna that you could actually hear your echoes coming back off the moon. But these days, it's a little different deal. A single long Yagi and 500 watts and pointed at the moon, and with WSJT, you can be successful.
Now, for most people, the moon is sitting there for quite a while, so you might have 2-3 hours worth of moon bounce activity.
Well, I mean, as long as the moon's up, I mean, it's up, 11 hours every day. Why, you have access to it. And by the way, moon bounce is a fun thing. It really is. I got intrigued by it way back reading about it in QST with Sam Harris and all of those people and the Rhododendron VHF Society. And, I always was kind of intrigued with it as a kid. And so, you begin to, just get up the antennas up and then that led to VHF and UHF contesting. And we built several stations, very big stations, to be able to contest. And when you're in the Midwest, in Kansas and Colorado, I mean, you've got to work 500, 600 miles just to make contacts.
I interviewed in episode 142 George Freeman, K5TR, and he quoted you as saying, troposcatter is about power and antenna gain not affected by propagation. Now, it's my assumption that you're relying on all kinds of things to be able to talk farther than line of sight, because we think of, these frequencies. If you're not bouncing off the moon, you have to bounce off of something else because, as soon as the horizon disappears, so does the signal. Is that really the case?
It is. I think most people don't realize the troposphere is a reflector. It depends on humidity. It depends on temperature. It depends on a number of things. But if you begin to think about it, there are equations that have been worked out that the U.S. government worked on way back in the 50s on troposcatter paths. And again, if you have enough power and you have a big enough antenna, at amateur power levels, at 1,500 watts and say a 21, 22 dB gain antenna, you sit down and look at the physics on it, and, 500 miles, 600 miles is certainly not out of the question. And if you have some enhancement, out to 1,000 miles, we regularly here on the East Coast have tropospheric openings. And, we work down in Florida, work up into New England from North Carolina and do it with a kilowatt in a single 12-element Yagi. And if you draw a circular around where we happen to live here, 500 miles, I mean, on CW, it's very regular. You can always make contacts out that far. And so it's just a matter of physics and understanding the way things work.
In order for you to operate 4 50-element Yagis, you're actually raising the azimuth and going back. So essentially you can follow the moon if you want. It's my understanding there's a bunch of operators in Europe that only point at the horizon. They don't have the azimuth capability. They're just going right and left. And they're only operating maybe 500 watts, even 100 watts. Is that even possible, say, on 2-meter or UHF moon bounce?
Oh, of course, yeah. It depends on the other station. We were talking about a station that we'd operated out in Kansas at WB0DRL, which is now N0OY. We had a 30-foot dish that was steerable. With a 30-foot dish and about 800 watts, we could actually work rate off of the moon with Europeans when the moon was coming up in Kansas during a contest. And you could sit there and with 1 minute sequencing, you could work, in a half hour, you could work 10 stations. This is on 1.2 gig. And so again, it's having a big enough antenna. And, that antenna was big enough, the 30-footer, that if you were on sideband and you would say hello moon and unkey, you would hear hello moon coming back. because it develops about 38 to 40 dB of gain. And with 800 watts into that, you do the math, that's a lot of effective radiated power.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA30N, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. If you get on 1.2 gigahertz moonbounds, are there people to talk to? Or is it like Rare DX?
Well, it's like most everything, there are fraternities of people, groups who have the same interest. And, there are the 1.2 gig people, there are the 2 meter people, there are the 6 meter people. There are all kinds, and people kind of have their favorite band, and people kind of congregate around a certain mode, and they build a community is basically what it is. It's an amateur radio community around a certain communication mode.
It's my understanding that you're a member of and former president of the Central States VHF Society?
Yes. Yeah, I've been president a couple of times.
What is the Central States VHF Society?
Well, that is what I would call a ham radio watering hole for people who are interested in VHF, UHF communications, and gets together usually about the last weekend in July, and it's been going on for probably close to 45, 50 years, and people get together and they talk about, how to do certain things, and there are seminars, and people will set up roving stations, and it's kind of a hands-on convention. And everybody knows everybody else. And, you take the family, and it's a family event. And for a weekend, from Thursday through Sunday, everybody gets together, and it's kind of like a big reunion every year. And it's a wonderful time to get together. But, then, as a VHF, UHF fraternity, basically what you do is you encourage and you go home and fires you up for another year of operating. And then you get together next year. And this year it was in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I happened to miss it. I was out of the country, and it's kind of like missing your family, but it requires that kind of a community for the advancement of technology. And there were 4 or 5 guys that started this way back in the 60s, and one of those was the fellow I talked about, W0EYE or W0PW, Don Hilliard, and a bunch of people, Jay Liebman from Oklahoma City, and other people that were, kind of messing around on those frequencies with a lot of power, and they got together, and that's how it got started. Central States VHF Society, still going today.
Right. So what we're talking about, and the reason I kind of brought this up is that I want to differentiate this from, FM and repeaters. What we're talking about here is operating all of the modes we would normally operate, perhaps on HF, on the VHF, UHF, and microwave bands.
That's true, yeah. It would be probably a little more specialized, more research-oriented. 2-meter FM repeaters are wonderful. I've been on repeater committees and repeater clubs, and, that creates a local community for people. It's been one of the greatest ways to get people together, hams together, here in the U.S. and also internationally. But then when you begin to go on beyond and you're doing things that are, require some specialization, that's why that would be the differentiating factor on something like Central States.
Now, you're also a member of the Radio Club of America. Could you say a little bit about what the Radio Club of America is and perhaps why hams should join it?
Well, the Radio Club of America is, let me put it this way, it's kind of people who have been distinguished in radio. It's not just a ham radio. It's broadcasting. It's other things. It's the use of RF energy. So people become a member of that, and it's a wonderful group of people. I have just become a member the last couple of years, and they get together with a big banquet every year and celebrate and recognize people who've done substantial things in terms of research or in terms of notable things. And it's a great gathering, and it's basically a professional society, more professional probably than ARRL or something like that, because it's broader than just ham radio.
I heard a podcaster, actually I heard someone who's not only a podcaster, but he's a celebrity of sorts in the media, and he mentioned ham radio in a disparaging way, like ham radio is just a bunch of old guys operating CW and sideband. Do you think it's an exciting time to be a ham, and why do you think that is?
Well, I think it is an exciting time because what you have is you have a blending these days of IT and RF. To give you an idea, the routers that you use in your home, with your computer, that was invented by a ham radio operator. Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was invented by ham. In fact, I know who actually invented that up at Collins Radio Company. He worked for Rockwell Collins. And he's in the same industry I am, in fact. There's a lot of things. Text, for an instance, came out of packet radio. And a group of hams over in Finland actually began to make that a commercial product. And today there are other things. For instance, one of the things we're working on in terms of one of the things I do is shortwave broadcasting and high power medium wave broadcasting, and what we're working on today is taking a 250,000 watt transmitter and turning it into a gigantic router into a 23 dB gain antenna at about anywhere from 13 to 18 megahertz and broadcasting into an Android receiver, SDR receiver, and downloading data, audio, and all kinds of things. Now, you know where that came from? That was a bunch of hams messing around with that in the ham bands, and now it has an application where you can communicate to a village anywhere and literally create the last mile of the Internet anywhere in the world that can receive shortwave broadcasts. See, those are the things that are really exciting, and for people who are coming out with an IT background out of college or out of university, there's all kinds of opportunities these days with the blending of RF and the whole digital technology, and it's fun. It really is. It's exploring a whole new world, and I think one of the things we as amateurs need to do is really expose people to that. We had, in our organization this summer, we had 17 interns. And, you sit there, and half of them are IT people. And they're from places like Case Western University, which is, and they sit here and they look at that and they go, wow. And then somebody will say, well, how did all that get started? And then we go up to the third floor. And only special people get to go to the third floor. And they see the K3 and they see the amplifier and they see, and then somebody says, well, you still operate international Morse code? I said, yeah, that's the first digital language. And and then that evolves to another discussion. But, it's still the formulative brew of where the ideas come from. And ham radio really hasn't changed. And so it's a great platform to move into the future for a career. It's a great platform for innovation. And it's pretty incredible when you think about it.
Yeah, I pinch myself all the time, especially when I'm having conversations like this on the QSO Today podcast. You're the international president of TWR International. What is TWR International? Because you've alluded a few times in this conversation of the organization that you're with. What is TWR International, and what does it do?
Well, TWR got started about 60 years ago, and it's an international broadcaster. We broadcast with extremely high power AM in the medium wave band and also shortwave, and now we're into digital communication. And we deliver content to 100 about 190 countries every day and 230 languages. For anybody, for a ham, I mean, it's really fun to be able to sit there and look at a 450,000 watt AM transmitter that's operating on 800 kilohertz internationally. And if you like RF and you like high power RF, I mean, you can. It's pretty exciting stuff. But we can deliver that content, almost anywhere in the world, and we're probably better known outside the United States because we're really not here in the U.S. We're an international content delivery and broadcast organization, and frankly, we just have a whole lot of fun. And if you're a ham, that's a lot of fun because it's applied technology.
Okay, so TWR International is essentially the distribution mechanism. You're not creating all of the content in 230 languages?
We do. Yeah, we create content. We have production facilities all over the world, and we create. We're international spiritual broadcasters, Christian broadcasters, and we speak to countries, and we're involved in basically providing hope to an awful lot of people around the world.
Well, I thought what was impressive, I looked at your website. You have a list of employees worldwide. And what was interesting is the employees are husband and wives around the world, not just, individuals. And I thought that was that's very interesting. So you're sending teams around the world in order to spread your message, but also to facilitate the communication.
Well, we have some phenomenally talented people who are involved in the organization. I think of one couple that are in West Africa. The wife is a medical doctor. They're from South Africa. The wife's a medical doctor, and he's an engineer, and he's probably runs one of the best economic development type things on the 250 acres that our transmitters are located in this particular country. He raises yellow teak, and he trains young men right out of the village, literally out of the villages, how to be RF engineers. They have a scholarship fund. They raise cashew. They have a cashew orchard that they all work in, and the money off of that educates young men. So when you put all that together, I mean, it puts value into the country. It puts value into a region because the 100,000 watt AM station covers most of West Africa at night. The people who are there and their staff who are there it's an interesting mix to look at and to be involved with.
Now, before the internet started connecting the world, how did TWR move content from its centers out into the periphery to these transmitting stations?
Well, it used to be by magnetic tape, and you would ship tape between the production center in a language and into a transmission site. TWR actually got started in Tangiers in the late 50s, and when Tangiers became Morocco, then they lost their license, and then they moved to Radio Monte Carlo, and at night it was TWR. It was a 1 million watt station that Hitler had actually built to talk to the Third Reich and never got it on the air. And here it is being used in an entirely different manner and to talk to Europe and Eastern Europe in those days and down into North Africa. And then we built facilities in the Caribbean and in Asia. We currently have about 23 transmission facilities around the Earth.
And when you're talking 500,000 watts and 1 million watts, what kind of rigs are these?
Big, really big.
Custom built, or are they commercial built?
Well, these days for medium wave AM, most of it's solid state. It's not tubes. And the solid state technology has really become very efficient these days. And so if something happens, you take a lightning strike or something, it'll burn out one or two of the power modules, and it just continues on the air. So it's a rather sophisticated technology. On shortwave, however, because you have to be frequency agile in the HF bands, you're still using tubes. 250,000 watt tubes, which are really a couple of 100,000 watt tubes that are vapor cooled, And you look at the extremely high voltage and extremely high amperage and antennas that are 23 dB gain curtain antennas. Until you've taken a 100-watt ham radio and put it into one of these curtain antennas on 20 meters, and you have an EME style antenna on 20 meters with a 100-watt radio, I mean, you can have a lot of fun on that.
And have you done that?
I have.
Well, that sounds amazing. So these transmitters actually have to be placed in rural locations with lots of real estate. And how do you power 1 million watts or 500,000 watts? Are you generating your own power?
In some cases we do. Other cases we don't. We buy it. It just happens to depend on what the situation is. Some of them we have our own power generation facilities.
It's an amazing operation. I mean, I've never talked to anybody that has an operation like this.
Well, we are the largest broadcaster in the world right now.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. Nuts and Bolts Magazine is a new sponsor and is an amazing resource for new and old hams alike. Click on the banner to get your online or paper subscription of Nuts and Bolts. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. It's my understanding that you're a big supporter of DXpeditions and that you've been on some DXpeditions yourself. What would you say is the most interesting DXpedition you've gone on?
Oh, I think I got interested in DXpeditions going down to Belize on 6 meters. This was back in the 90s, and actually I'm still licensed down there, Victor 31 Julie Oscar. And so when we'd go down there on family vacations, I would take a rig along and, a couple of 100 watts and operate on 6 meters and try to do it, in December, in July or June when the sporadic E or the F2 was doing well. And that's kind of what got me interested. And then I began to travel for work. And in some of these countries that I'm involved in, you take a rig along and you're able to operate in the country, and it just kind of depends on whether you can get a license or not. In some of these countries, it's pretty hard to get a license. And for an instance, when I go down to the island of Bonaire, we have a transmitter there. You just operate with a PJ4/ then your call, and it's a lot of fun to be able to operate from those type of locations, and at night to be able to get on HF or VHF and from 6 meters, during the summertime is a lot of fun when you get down around the equator, because there's some very interesting things that occur. And we're planning a couple of other DXpeditions to other countries. I'm not going to talk about them right now, but they'll probably be 6 meter type operations, and who knows, probably even off the moon.
So if you're taking a portable 6 meter transceiver on a DXpedition to do moon bounce, what kind of equipment would you take?
Well, have you interviewed Lance W7GJ?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, Lance is really the guru of 6 meter moon bounce. I mean, this guy has gone all over the world, and he takes a single, I think, 8-element Yagi and aims it manually at the moon with a 1 kilowatt, and using WSJT technology will probably work, a couple hundred stations on 2 meters. It's not all that hard anymore, really, when you stop and think about it. You can put all that stuff in a duffel bag and, a couple of hard-sided cases and check them through as luggage, and you're operational wherever you happen to be.
Yeah, Lance was our guest in episode 59. He's W7JG, if people want to look him up. He has a YouTube video of, he's on some island in the South Pacific, and when you think South Pacific and you think of these islands, you're thinking maybe like Bora Bora, Tahiti, like some amazing place to be. But his YouTube video shows him dragging all of his equipment down this rocky beach, and it looks like the worst place in the world to be. And Lance, it looks like he'll go just about anywhere in order to make a very interesting DXpedition 6 meter moon bounce.
Well, I would call Lance a true adventurer. He really is. And I've known Lance for, I don't know, 25, 30 years. We've been close friends. And, of course, we're VHF and UHF. And it's just interesting to watch. In fact, he's been a mentor to me on this. I kind of watch him and I go, well, guess it isn't all that hard. And so you talk to him and you talk to people who actually do that. Or, it might be another band or something. And I think of other people like Mike Stahl, K6MYC, who has done that sort of thing, or Jim Trebig, who has, been all over the world and done that. And a number of these people have really blazed a lot of trails. And they're interesting people. And, to sit there and listen to them and you talk to them, you think, well, yeah, that's doable.
Well, when we think of, for example, like the DXCC, if you've done DXCC on the HF, it seems to me that there's a lot of ripe open territory to try to do DXCC on moonbounce, on VHF, UHF, and even, 1.2 gigahertz. It seems like the field's wide open for that.
It is. It's just a question of doing it. And to be honest with you, to be able to do that, though, takes an awful lot of time. It takes a lot of commitment. And, to be able to, I've never had the luxury of pouring that kind of time into it. But people who have DXCC on 2 meters, I think of W5UN, a real trailblazer. I think he was either number 1 or number 2 or maybe number 3 on 2 meters to have DXCC. And you think about that. DXCC on 2 meters, that's pretty incredible.
And was that all moonbounce, do you think, or it would have to be?
Well, yes. Most of it was moonbounce, yeah. And he had a tremendously large array in Texas. It was just incredible. When you looked at it, it was steerable and, huge. And this was in the days before WSJT. This was on CW.
You mentioned roving stations. Do you do roving?
Have, yes. Don't have a lot of time for it these days. Kind of busy. But, to be able to go out into eastern Colorado, western Kansas, and put a bunch of antennas on top of your car, and you sit there and operate back to stations 300-400 miles away, and it's a lot of fun. And since grid squares have come in on VHF, UHF operating, a lot of these grid squares are pretty rare. And so people will go out there and, with a rig and an antenna and set up and operate from a grid square during a contest, or for people who want to collect grid squares. And it's a lot of fun to be out there. I'd say it's recreational activity. And you get to see some very, very interesting things. I remember one time I was in western Kansas and I was operating 1.2 gigahertz. We were giving out grids when grids first came out, and I was on this farm, and the farmer came along, and I'm sure he was convinced that I was there for no good, because you're sitting there with an antenna and a radio, and you're sending international Morse code, and you can just imagine this farmer looking at me. He says, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, it's top secret." "Really?" "Oh, yeah. This is top secret research." "Oh, well, have fun." And he drove off. Those are the kinds of things you get into. But roving's a lot of fun, and people go out and do it. And, it's a very interesting exercise.
When we refer to roving in amateur radio, we're actually referring to VHF and above mobile operations. It's different than people that are operating SOTA or like national parks on the air. The name roving implies in ham radio that this is a VHF, UHF activity?
Yeah, it is. And to give you an idea, I drove a Jeep Cherokee when I was in Colorado, and I would strap a platform on the top on the luggage rack and put a 2 meter, 6 meter, 432 and 1296 beams. And then you'd drive up to a high place. You'd figure out where the highest place was, happened to be in a grid square, and point from that. You'd point the car and sit there and work stations. And then there would be another station, so you just turn the car around and, operate, because you're operating with pretty high gain Yagis. But, it's fun. You see an awful lot of real estate. You meet a lot of interesting people, and And plus, you get to operate, for a weekend. It's pure recreation.
What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
Well, I think one of the things that I notice with hams is sometimes they get pretty obsessive with ham radio, and I've known families that are broken up. And so my wife and I, she's not in a ham, and my son is not an amateur radio operator, and I determined to. I've watched amateurs try to get their kids into ham radio and get their license and force them into it. And I decided I wasn't going to do that with our son. He grew up with me operating and doing all kinds of weird things with squeaks and squawks in the middle of the night and up and trying to do meteor scatter. And he would come down and sit and watch for a while and go back up and go to bed. But we've always made sure that there's a balance in our family. Our family comes before ham radio operations. And so, I think for a lot of hams, sometimes you can really get committed to things and the family begins to suffer. But I think it's very, very important. Life needs to be balanced. There's more than just ham radio and more than just work. When you stop and think about it, your family is one of your biggest lasting legacies you'll leave on planet Earth.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Well, I mentioned the whole digital technology.
Mm-hmm.
That really excites me. I enjoy relationships. Countries I go to, you always meet hams. You meet amateurs everywhere. I don't think there's been a country that I've gone to, and I've now been in about 98 countries in the world, where you don't meet an amateur radio operator if you happen to look for them. And they're great people. There's an instantaneous rapport. It's a real fellowship. I remember working King Hussein one time on the air and thinking, this is an amazing hobby. How in the world would you ever meet someone like that outside of amateur radio? And I met some of the most exciting, some of the most intriguing people globally through amateur radio. It is a great affiliation, and it's a great fraternity.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Well, pick out something you really like to do. I mean, what's your interest? What's something you've always wanted to do? And then specialize in that and do a lot of it. And then you'll have interests that stem off from that, from something else. It might be HF, it might be VHF, it might be moon bounce, it might be digital, it might be any whisper, it might be any number of things. But just figure out something that's intriguing to you, and then get the equipment and do it and accomplish it. And that gives you a sense of accomplishment, and that will spur you on to the next thing. At least that's been true in my life with amateur radio as being a rather intriguing hobby.
Yeah, I think it's like putting the layers back on the onion. As you work your way out, more and more things just happen to pile on. What great advice. That's really good. Lauren, I want to thank you so much for coming on QSO Today. It was remarkable. I had a great time, so I hope you did as well.
Oh, I certainly did, and thank you so very much. To those of you who are listening, I hope you have as much fun with ham radio as I have. And it's a hobby that goes through your whole life. It's something you can do for the rest of your life. With sports, you can't necessarily do that. With amateur radio, I mean, it goes from starting point to ending point, and it's a great hobby, and it's also a great platform to develop yourself professionally and relationally, not just in a country, but internationally as well.
I think that's a terrific way to end. 73. Thanks, Lauren.
73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope you enjoyed this QSO with Lauren. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W0LD in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to Icom America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of this fine sponsor by clicking on their link in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, click on the transcribe button at the top of the show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. By using the Amazon link on the home page before you shop at Amazon allows Amazon to send us a small commission on what you purchase that further keeps our QSO Today project going. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as we work towards episode 500. QSO Today is now available on a large number of podcast players and now a host of podcast services and applications. We are Podcast 2.0 compatible. I now use the Fountain podcast player to listen to all of my favorite podcasts. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.